Who were the Mandeans? And do some scholars believe they have originated from followers of John the Baptist in the Jordan Valley, that they considered John to be the Messiah while Jesus and Paul were the heretics, and that they helped originate Gnosticism? Aren't there still communities of them today?
Yeah, so the Mandeanism is a religion that was. It's hard to know when it began because the Mandeans have always claimed they started at the beginning, and so it's like, and so it's hard to know. They're a dual, so they do exist still today as a small group. They may have been in competition with Christianity at one point in the early centuries. Um, they are a religion that is dualistic in nature, that stresses very much the opposition of the forces of good and evil, which are portrayed as the forces of light and darkness, and they're at constant battle with each other. They have sacred scriptures. They're not Christian. They are more like Gnostics in their dualism and their relationships between Mandeans and Gnostics. We have some of the Mandean texts. One of their texts is called the Book of John, and that's not the Gospel of John. It's a different John. It's John the Baptist. But the three main books they have are all mainly filled with their teachings. About these oppositions of light and darkness and how it gets worked out in various mythological ways. But this book of John does have a chapter about the life of John the Baptist, and it's quite clear that John the Baptist was an important figure in the movement, and Mandeans do claim him as one of their own. And so yeah, so it's not one of these areas that is extensively studied by scholars of Christianity. It probably should be. There are books written about it, and there are people who are experts on it, but it's not like a major field the way, say, Gnosticism is in Christian studies. But there do continue to be the story that they tell themselves is that they emigrated from Palestine, that they came out of Palestine and then settled in up north of the Persian Gulf, and that's where historically the communities have been up north of the Persian Gulf.
Thank you so much for that. Really appreciate it. Who was Tatian, and what was the Diatessaron? What importance do scholars attach to his role in early Christianity?
Okay, Tatian was a Christian teacher who came from Syria, who emigrated to Rome, and in the middle of the 2nd century was a student of Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr was one of the first kind of intellectuals of Christianity in Rome. He's our first apologist who works Survive at Length, a defender of the Christian faith. And so he was this philosopher, a Christian philosopher in Rome, and Tatian came to study with him. Tatian, we don't know a lot about Tatian's life. He eventually left Rome and went back to Syria. He's famous for two things. One is that he had a very strict kind of morality, and he's sometimes called an encretite. Encretism is a kind of like ascetic lifestyle where you deny yourself the pleasures of the flesh. And so he's thought of as an encretite. But the more famous thing about Tatian is that he produced an edition of the Gospels. The edition of the Gospels is called the Diatessaron. Diatessaron, if you spell it out, dia means through in Greek, like going through something, and tesseron is four, so through the four. This is a gospel harmony. What he did is he took what we think of as the four gospels, and he combined them into one large narrative. And so that you'll have part of Matthew, part of Mark, and kind of all interwoven, so that when you get a story that you get in different versions of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, say, it gets presented as one story in the Diatessaron. So it's a very large book, and it became it was the gospel used in Syriac-speaking Christianity for centuries. They did not use what they called the separate gospels. The separate gospels being Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They used the Diatessaron. Unfortunately, we don't have it. And one of the thorniest, oh my God, one of the hardest areas of New Testament studies, I mean, where angels fear to tread, is trying to figure out what the original Diatessaron said. And there've been major developments in that over the last 20 years. But it is a mind-boggling exercise to try and figure out what was originally in the Diatessaron, in part because we have other gospel harmonies that are probably unrelated to the Diatessaron. And so when you find like a church father quoting a harmonious text, it's hard to know what he's quoting. And so, but there are scholars who spend, I know people who spent their lives trying to figure out the Diatessaron.
Yeah, one of the things about it that really makes me personally wonder what the motivating factor for creating the Diatessaron was for is they saw problems. So maybe they saw multiple narratives and they wanted to unify what the narrative probably was, I guess. Was this an apologetic, you think, to
It's a good question, and I think it's hard to know if that was the motivation. It's certainly plausible as a motivation, that you've got these contradictions and you smooth them out by putting them together. Another plausible motive is that you've got these four accounts. Wouldn't it be convenient just to have them all in one place? And if you have different gospel writers writing different versions, it'd be nice to have the full version.
Yeah, because if I may ask, just to probe you on this even further, do you personally think, and this is speculation, but do you personally think whoever wrote Mark would be rolling over in their grave to know that his document is sitting right next to this document by a person they call Matthew, and Matthew sitting next to a document by a person named Luke, when they are purposely writing contrary material? Like it seems like they're competing, it appears.
If you take an article that I wrote and you put it in a collection with an article that Richard Carrier wrote, and then you interpreted my article in light of his article, like
Right.
Ehrman, Carrier's, I probably would think, that's really not how I want you to interpret my article. And probably Mark would have been the first, and he probably had no idea others were going to do it, but he certainly did not expect somebody like Matthew to come along and change what he said for his gospel, and then think, well, Matt and Luke, especially, I think Luke would especially roll over in his grave, because Luke begins his gospel by saying that many others have tried to make it, tried to explain what happened in the life of Jesus. Now I'm going to give you the accurate account. And you put his gospel next to these two of them that he might have, one of them that he used, that he changed, and you're thinking, no, I've got the accurate account.
Right.
So yeah, this is a later move, and it's the hardest thing for me to get my students to understand that Mark is not Matthew, and what John says is not what Luke is saying. And these are different authors, because you buy them, it's in one book. And so naturally you just think it's one author. No, it's not one author.
Might I ask why you think that is? Do you think it's because of our upbringings in evangelicalism or in a particular religious backgrounds that make us difficult for us to compartmentalize? Or
I don't think it's about evangelicalism. I think it's about the canonization of the Bible. When the church fathers decided to make a canon, a collection of books that would be the authoritative books, they're all authoritative on the same level. And since they're all authoritative on the same level, you can put them in between bound covers and they're all saying the same thing. And this was a decision that was both to control various heretical understandings, because certain books were left out. That's not authoritative, only these are authoritative. So it leaves things out, but it also smooths over the differences. And so it's in order to provide a unified vision, but the unified vision comes only by putting all these things together rather than letting them circulate separately.
I have to tell everybody right now, if you haven't watched his Genesis lectures, must go, because you talk about the greatest discovery, and I thought this was a profound statement by you. The greatest discovery is not the Dead Sea Scrolls. The greatest discovery is not the Nag Hammadi. The greatest discovery is not this text, that text. It's finding out that the books are not written by the same people, and they're written in different places with different agendas, contradictory motives, whatever it might be. The point is compartmentalizing text, and sometimes the texts themselves are written by multiple authors, and different sections in that book may not even be by the same person. That was the greatest discovery, and I think that if we apply that same logic to the New Testament, we can also say that's the greatest discovery. So thank you so much for that, Dr. Ehrman.
Yeah.
Okay, so who were the Nestorians, and is it true they were largely responsible for the spread of Christianity in Central and East Asia prior to the rise of Islam in the 7th century?
The Nestorians are They're named that after Nestorius, who had Christological views that were different from the Orthodox views. They were important for the spread of Christianity. They're after my period. I know very little about them.
Yeah. You would probably refer us to Shoemaker or someone in the into
anybody who's doing late antiquity. Look, the Christological controversies, I don't think people realize this. The Christological controversies after the Council of Nicaea get really, really complicated. They have to do with, because people think that everything got decided at the Council of Nicaea. Okay, he's fully God, he's fully man, completely equal to God. Fine, let's move on. Yeah, the moving on thing, it gets really, really complicated because people have to resolve whether Christ. So if Christ is both God and man, he's both human and divine. Is he like 100% of each? Is he 50% of each? Does he have two spirits? Is he like both? Does he have a divine thing and a human thing competing in each other, or is he just one, or is he just the other? And so the debates get actually more intense after the Council of Nicaea, and the logic gets more and more refined to a point that it's kind of hard to explain simply what these various debates are to normal human beings. So,
like, who died on the cross is such a difficult thing. Is it just the man, or is it
that goes way back, of course, because the Gnostics insisted that the man died, but the Christ survived. But then, if Christ doesn't have a human body, soul, and spirit. Suppose his spirit is divine, but the body and soul are human. So, once you get into these kinds of controversies, it gets very complicated.
Exactly. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Ehrman. Didn't some early Christian churches who were located outside the Roman Empire develop different canons for their Bibles than the 66 eventually agreed upon by the Proto-Orthodox Church? For example, doesn't the Ethiopian Church accept 81 books as sacred up to this day? It appears the standard canon remains fluid even now, since Protestant and Catholic Bibles differ, while Luther debated whether to include James and Revelation in his German translation. Even today, with the 1940s recovery of the Gospel of Thomas, some scholars wonder whether it should be added to the canon.
Well, it's a complicated question. And there are churches with different canons. That's true. But it's a question of what it means when one says that it's fluid, because in none of these communities is it fluid. In other words, in the Protestant tradition, when you have 27 books in the New Testament, it's true that other traditions might have, other books, but the Protestant tradition not fluid. You're not going to start finding bookstores selling Bibles with, you're just not. And so the reality is the canon was never fixed. People have this idea that, there was a vote at the Council of Nicaea or something, or that the Emperor Constantine decided when the canon was going to be. And none of that's true. There never was a vote. The first vote ever taken on the canon by a worldwide church council, I'm talking about a worldwide church council, was the Council of Trent in the 16th century. It's the first time any major council took a vote on the canon. And they were voting because they wanted to include the Apocrypha, because the Protestants were rejecting it. And so I wouldn't say that the canon is fluid. I say there are different canons in different Christian communities. And that is absolutely true. And I'll say, by the way, I've decided, now that I finished writing whatever book I was writing, my next major book, I'm thinking about doing a book on the canon. Because it's and probably a popular book on the canon as well, to explain to people how all this happened, because it's the question I get almost more than any other. How do we get this? And I think there's not really a book that I can refer people to that I think is really a popular book that I like. So
yeah, there's a lot of conspiracies about this issue, and I think it's necessary that someone sticks with the facts, shows what happened, give us the case. But oftentimes in this field, I do hear an apologetic is that, early church fathers already had a situated, steady canon that they used from Justin Martyr, onward. They were all using what we have as the New Testament. So they're making this
true. It's not true. Just not true. It's false. And historically false. Yeah. Demonstrably false.
You're going to show it. You're going to show this.
There's not much to show. All you have to do, like anybody who does any research at all can show that's not true. It's just not true. So my first article that I ever published back in 1983, so near 40 years ago now, was dealing with one aspect of this problem. What scholars had long said was, and scholars still will say, even though it's wrong, is that the canon wasn't fixed at the Council of Nicaea, but that the canon was fixed by Bishop Athanasius in Alexandria, Egypt. In the year 369, he wrote his 52nd festal letter. The festal letter went out every year in order to establish. Never mind. It's a letter he wrote every year to his churches. And in this letter, he listed our 27 books of the New Testament, and he said these are the books of the New Testament. Boom, 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 and it's our 27 books. And scholars always have said that's when it's 379. And that's when it was fixed. And so my first scholarly article, I mentioned earlier Didymus the Blind. Reading through Didymus's writings, I realized that he had a larger canon. There are books of the New Testament he thought were parts of the New Testament that were not in Athanasius's list. And he and Athanasius were living at the same time in the same city.
Wow.
And so I showed, so this is an article I published in a European journal, and I just showed that Didymus had a different understanding. And so Athanasius did not settle the canon in the year 379, and it never was completely settled because these different churches have different things. So these people who say that it was established in the 2nd century, it's just completely bogus. It's not true. You can show it's not, because you can see we have lists of which books are in the canon from after Justin that have different books. So how can you say it was fixed?
Wow. I really appreciate that. Our final question, and I don't know how much of this you'll be able to answer. You might have to refer to someone else who specializes in it, but he probably knows something. Does the DNA or do DNA studies show significant genetic differences between Jews and other peoples living in the Near East?
I don't know.
I don't either.
I don't know what that, I'm not even sure what it means. I mean,
like if we were trying to, maybe I'm going to guess here, because you know how they get back to like, where does Israel come from, right? And we could say they were Canaanites using internal evidence, but some argue there's a genetic reason that they think that there's a relationship between Israelites and Canaanites. I don't know the genetic stuff.
I see what they're saying.
I wonder if that's what is being meant here by
what they're saying. I think the answer is no. I mean, if you trace DNA samples to various people living in the Levant, there's not a genetic difference between Israelites and Canaanites in a significant genetic difference. No. Right. I thought this question was doing something a little bit more insidious than that. In the 19th century, anthropologists just started developing race theories about various races and trying to explain why there's such differences in different locations around the world. And they developed this idea of these various races of the human, and that led to a Semitic race. And once you start having these races, then one might be superior to another. And so the whole Nazi program was built on the superiority of the Aryan race because of bloodlines. And so it turned out being really a very very dangerous set of propositions. And so I thought they were going that way. So if they're talking about, is there any kind of genetic difference between the people who emerged as Israel and the people who emerged as, the Philistines or something, the answer is probably no. I don't think so. No.
What if we were digging up bones, let's say, or we had some DNA to test on a first century body between a Roman, let's say, or a Greek and a Jew, someone who might be a practicing Jew? Is there any way to know that one is coming from a Semitic culture and they might have genetic similarities that we can use to say, hey, this seems to be the family groups of particular people of culture in this region are different than what we find within Greek?
You can trace where the people came from, but you can't trace what they believed or what they practiced. I mean, Jewish culture was practiced in Rome. And so Jewish culture was practiced in Jerusalem. Roman culture was practiced in Israel. And so there's a difference between genetic makeup and, I mean, genetic makeup has to do with your ancestry. It doesn't have to do with your culture or your religion. Right. And so, I think what DNA can show is where people came from. And so what I would suggest, if somebody digs up two people from from the first century, and you want to know, what I suggest is they go to ancestry.com or
I'm with you. I'm with you.
Plug it in and see what you get.